announcements. I have both my guests here. Dr. Hannah Irish, welcome.
Hi there.
And Dr. Cindy Caldwell, welcome. This is Dr. Annalisa Durr with Journey to the Goddess TV, where together we will regenerate ancient feminine wisdom for modern women. And this time the focal point will be how Jesus manifests that, which is really exciting. We may even touch a little bit on Mary Magdalene. I know a subject that many of us here like to discuss. But before we jump into the PowerPoint and the Q&A, which will be the format for today, I'm going to give a brief bio for both of my distinguished guests. Dr. Hannah Irish is a writer, storyteller, editor, and educator. She recently completed her doctorate in mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology. Her dissertation re-mythologizes Jesus as a manifestation of the archetypal Christ and an embodied eco-feminist. Hannah continues to pursue her passion for recovering the divine feminine in Christian traditions, the divine in nature, and Sophia-Jesus in us all. Excellent. And here at the bottom of my screen, I have Dr. Cindy Caldwell, and she has her PhD in mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology, just like Hannah, just like myself. She is also a lover of birds, especially woodpeckers and kingfishers. That's exciting. Cindy makes her living as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and is in the process of creating a class on DEI and Bible stories. Cindy wrote her dissertation on the changing myth of Mary Magdalene and is the adult education elder for Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in Tacoma, Washington. Okay, here we go. Welcome to the show. I'm going to turn this on silent now. And I think I'm ready to have you give a brief description of how you kind of came to this work, and then we can jump into the PowerPoint.
Great. So briefly, I was raised in evangelical Christianity, and all of the fundamentalist and biblical literalism elements that often entails. But I ended up at a more liberal Christian university that started kind of poking holes in what I thought I believed from the way that I was raised. And lots of ups and downs, lots of questions and challenges. And eventually I was led to Pacifica Graduate Institute to the Mythological Studies program. And I had no idea when I enrolled in an academic journey what a personal and spiritual journey I was also embarking on. But it turned out to be everything I wanted and everything I didn't know that I needed. I'm really especially grateful for the instructors that I had who allowed me to engage class material through my lens of struggling with my birth tradition, which really opened me up to so many different perspectives from within the Christian traditions. And it was my Christian traditions class in our third year where the idea for my dissertation was birthed. I didn't exactly know it at the time that I turned in my term paper, but my instructor, who then became my dissertation chair, he knew it because he wrote on my paper, "Are you thinking about this for your dissertation?" So really, I just, through the years, found myself disillusioned with the Christianity that I had been raised in and had been exposed to, but I could not shake the draw to the figure of Jesus as presented in the 4 canonical Gospels. And so it was a journey of figuring out how to reconcile my life experience, my personal values and worldviews with this Jesus guy who really can be a stumbling block for a lot of people. And I was determined to figure out a different way of understanding him that would be more welcoming to the people who have been historically marginalized and oppressed by the church and the church's mainstream understandings and representations of Jesus. So this presentation tonight is adapted from my dissertation. It is chapter 5, essentially, of my dissertation. My whole dissertation is titled Continuing the Incarnation, re-mythologizing Jesus as a manifestation of the Archetypal Christ and embodied ecofeminist. So this chapter focuses on looking at Jesus as an embodied ecofeminist. For the sake of time, I'm not covering a lot of the theological background that I wove into this, as far as feminist theology, embodied theology, story theology, kind of all of the lenses that I used. Nor am I getting much into the exploration of the divine feminine in Christianity, or Jesus as a manifestation of the archetypal Christ. So this really is just focusing on Jesus as we see him in the Gospels interacting with women and the earth. So re-imaging Jesus, exploring the Gospels to discover Jesus as embodied ecofeminist. Can a male savior save women? Feminists ask how a male savior can save women when women have historically been barred from church leadership and equal discipleship, specifically because they don't share Jesus's maleness. I was raised to believe that women could serve in the church, but they could never hold positions of spiritual authority over men. This belief was something I took for granted until I started my undergraduate education. My Christian liberal arts university, which was founded by the Quaker Church, had a woman pastor, Sarah. This was earth-shattering for my 18-year-old evangelical Christianity. However, I slowly learned to see her for who and what she was, an educated, qualified pastor who had a compassionate, gracious, generous, and humble heart for her congregation. Shortly after college, when I began work as a youth leader, I sought a woman mentor from the church. Julie had volunteered regularly in the high school Sunday school class. We met regularly for most of the 2 years I worked there. She held space for me to negotiate my own life as a young woman, specifically as I navigated being a spiritual leader for teenagers. As it would happen, struggling to reconcile my own life with my job requirements eventually led to my resignation. For 2.5 years after leaving my job at the church, I avoided institutional Christianity. The autumn that I began my graduate studies, I felt like my faith and spirituality were spiraling as I questioned everything I thought I believed. I knew who Martha was, as she was on staff at my university while I was a student. And while she had heard of me through mutual connections, we'd never met. By the time of our first meetup, she had completed her own seminary studies and was ordained in the Quaker Church. We met regularly for coffee, and she held space for my questions and doubts. She was the first person to suggest to me that I could love and follow Jesus outside of the church. These 3 women were all examples of faithful discipleship, compassion, and grace. After my life-changing experiences with them, my consent to the theological argument that women can't be pastors because they're not male, as Jesus was male, had crumbled to dust. Surely something was missing in this logic. The maleness of Jesus as a cornerstone for theology and doctrine regarding the equal humanity, agency, and value of women seemed nothing more than a logical fallacy, a false equivalency. So, rather than relying on doctrinal and theological tradition, I turned back to the gospel narratives themselves to investigate what Jesus's interactions with women implied about his views about them. This investigation subsequently led to my exploration of Jesus's relationship to the earth through the lens of ecofeminism. The stories of Jesus and women, and of Jesus and the earth, show that Jesus can be imaged as an embodied ecofeminist. His care for the physical health and well-being of those around him points to an embodied spirituality rather than a transcendent one, which cares little for the physical reality of his community. His life and ministry evidence the belief in the full humanity of women, and he actively pushes against his culture's oppression of women, treating them as children of Sophia-Yahweh, made in the divine image, equal to men. The life and ministry of Jesus are rooted in the physical, lived reality of humans on earth. His teaching and healing emphasize the value of the human body, and his esteem and respect for the natural world are evident in his own spiritual practice, in his miracles, and in his teaching. First century Palestine was patriarchal, and the Jewish community was largely governed by the temple purity system. Thus, Jesus' love toward women, evidenced in his care for their situations and his willingness to help them, is countercultural. Though the Gospels include dozens of encounters between Jesus and women, and countless more between Jesus and other marginalized people, I'm going to talk about just a few. The woman with the flow of blood, the woman caught in adultery, the Syrophoenician woman, Mary and Martha, and Jesus' women followers. These stories evidence Jesus' radical compassion, generosity, and respect toward women, as well as his inclusive table fellowship and discipleship of equals. The Synoptic Gospels all include the healing of a woman suffering from chronic hemorrhages. Matthew's account is rather brief. In the midst of a crowd, a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind Jesus and touched the fringe of his cloak, saying to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was healed. The accounts in Mark and Luke include additional details. Mark states that she had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, but instead of getting better, she grew worse. Luke says that although she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. Both her poverty and her chronic illness had social and religious impacts. Mark and Luke also state that her hemorrhage stopped immediately after she touched Jesus' clothes, and that Jesus was aware of it and asked who touched him. The disciples tell Jesus it's impossible to know, since they are in the middle of a crowd of people pressing in on them. However, the woman falls at Jesus' feet and tells him that she touched him, and why. Jesus responds, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." In all three accounts, by seeking to simply touch his clothing, the woman tries to avoid being noticed by both Jesus and the crowd. Leonard Swidler suggests that her shyness isn't because she is poor or lower class. Rather, due to chronic bleeding, for 12 years, she was designated impure by the purity system, barring her from participating in cultic activity. She was seen as somehow displeasing to God. Further, anything or anyone she touched would be rendered similarly unclean, especially a rabbi. Therefore, she violates ritual custom by touching Jesus while she's bleeding. However, not only does Jesus pay no mind to this breach, but rather commending her faith, healing her, and blessing her, he also calls attention to the healing, publicly rejecting the cultic impurity of a woman who had a flow of blood, menstrual or otherwise. Jesus' final statement to the woman encapsulates embodied ecofeminism. By calling her daughter, he expounds her worth and the imago Dei in which she is made. When he says, "Your faith has made you well," he recognizes and commends her agency in acting on her faith of her own accord. When he tells her to go in peace and be healed of your disease, he recognizes her embodied experiential reality, as well as dissolves the dualism between spirit, soul, or mind, and body, nature, and matter. Though he doesn't explicitly address it, Jesus would have been well aware that the woman's physical suffering impacted her social cultic status. His exhortation to go in peace therefore applies not only to her physical relief, but also to her renewed social situation. She's no longer barred from cultic activity due to her illness, and thus can engage in cultic purity. John's Gospel tells a story of a woman convicted of adultery, whom Jesus not only pardons, but saves from death by stoning. While he's teaching outside the temple, religious leaders bring the woman to him and say, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" Jesus responds, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." To which the accusers and bystanders react by walking away, leaving Jesus and the woman alone. He asks her where her accusers have gone, saying, "Has no one condemned you?" She answers that no one has condemned her, and Jesus tells her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." Jesus' quote, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her," is well known. In the gospel text itself, it may seem that Jesus simply verbally bests the scribes and Pharisees, as he does in other gospel accounts. However, Sweidler explains that if Jesus agrees to the stoning, he violates Roman law, which limits capital punishment to itself. Yet, if Jesus objects, he violates Mosaic law. Additionally, Sweidler suggests that the religious leaders would not have thought of this as a trap for Jesus if he did not already have the culturally contradicting reputations of both great rabbi, teacher of the Torah, and champion of women. Thus, Jesus refuses to engage in legalisms and abstractions, and instead deals with all parties as spiritual, ethical, human persons, speaking to the accusers in the context of personal ethical conduct, and to the accused with compassion, but not approval. Finally, Sweidler observes that the scribes and Pharisees set this legal trap for Jesus by reducing a woman to a sex object. In his treatment of the leaders and the woman, Jennifer Nust states that, quote, "Jesus stood against any male-dominated status quo that seeks to deny women their full human dignity, irrespective of the charges against them. And that Jesus's words, the story's true meaning, affirm rather than objectify the human actors over whom he hovers, and valorizes the full humanity of the woman, undermines male dominance, and invites wayward men to repent of their own complicity in patriarchal injustice." Without using the term, Nust spells out the feminism in Jesus's words and actions. Without dehumanizing the woman's accusers, Jesus valorizes and affirms her full humanity and treats her with dignity. He also recognizes her agency when he exhorts her to not sin again. As Nust also points out, Jesus's words and actions directly oppose the patriarchal status quo, which is the foundational action of feminism. Matthew and Mark include the story of a woman who beseeches Jesus on behalf of her daughter, who is afflicted by a demon. While Matthew identifies her as a Canaanite woman, Mark states that she was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She's a triple outsider by virtue of her gender, ethnicity, and cultural religious affiliation. In both accounts, Jesus initially denies her request, saying, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." The woman responds, "Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." In this response, she engages in theological argument with Jesus, a traditionally men-only activity. Though she respects the primacy of the children of Israel, she makes a theological argument against limiting Jesus's inclusive table fellowship and discipleship of equals to Israel alone. She flips Jesus's own parabolic image against him, and she wins, overcoming Jesus's prejudice and achieving her daughter's well-being. Jesus replies to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter," which suggests the merits of her argument convinced Jesus to change his mind. Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza points out the surprising fact that, quote, "the major theologian and spokesperson for such a table sharing with Gentiles is a woman." Further, she asserts that the story makes visible women's contribution to one of the most crucial transitions in early Christian beginnings, in which the Syrophoenician woman is again visible as one of the apostolic foremothers of Gentile Christians. Sweidler also observes this, that the earliest recorded instance of Jesus going beyond his commission to Israel is to heal a female at the persistence of a woman. Additionally, Sweidler notes that the conversation with the Syrophoenician woman is both the only account of Jesus being verbally bested, and it's by a woman, and a unique account of Jesus learning something as an adult from another person who is a woman. The entire encounter is unique among the Gospels. First, Jesus uncharacteristically refuses a direct request for healing. In today's terminology, he does so in, at best, an ethnocentric manner, at worst, a racist manner. This is a rare scene in which Jesus appears almost too human. Then he engages a non-Jewish woman in theological debate, and she bests him. Though he makes a rough beginning, he nevertheless ultimately treats the woman with dignity and compassion, and once again acknowledges her full human agency. Though it is impossible to know why, the authors of Matthew and Mark deliberately included this story in their Gospels. Not only does it highlight the courage and philosophical insight of the Syrophoenician woman, it also highlights the fact that a man, even a rabbi, as renowned for wisdom and mercy and compassion as Jesus is, may learn from a woman standing her ground and even putting him in his place. Luke tells the story of Jesus' visit to the sisters Mary and Martha. Jesus and his disciples enter Martha's home, and her sister Mary sits and listens to Jesus. Martha is busy with many unspecified tasks and asks Jesus to have Mary help her. Jesus responds that Martha is worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. Though it's easy to interpret Jesus' treatment of Martha as negative, whether dismissing her feelings or disregarding her dedication to hosting duties, or even reprimanding her for not sitting with him and listening to him, there's little in the narrative to explain exactly what Martha was busy with or in what context. Unfortunately, in this passage, Mary and Martha have been anecdotally interpreted as foils of one another. Mary representing the better or even correct relationship to Jesus, Martha the lesser or incorrect relationship. However, Sweidler points out that the first notable point is that Jesus, contrary to strict custom, allows himself to be served by a woman. Martha's many tasks is the Greek diakonia, which can also be translated as serving or ministering. Noting that the text does not specify Martha's many tasks, and specifically that it does not state that she is in the kitchen preparing a meal, as is often assumed, Schussler Fiorenza states, quote, "The text merely states that she is preoccupied with too much serving, which in early Christian usage refers to Eucharistic table service in the house church. It was not, however, restricted to such service, since it also included the proclamation of the word. Therefore, it's impossible to know what was distracting Martha. It's an unfortunate, even sexist, interpretive leap to assume that Jesus is reprimanding her for being preoccupied with serving dinner. Further, when Jesus tells Martha that only one thing is needed and that Mary has chosen that one thing, it's assumed to be a reprimand, but could equally be an invitation. Jesus doesn't tell Martha to stop doing whatever she's doing, or that there's anything wrong with what she's doing, only that he will allow Mary to continue what she has chosen. Mary has chosen to sit at Jesus' feet and listen to him. The text doesn't specify what he was saying, though that Mary sat at the Lord's feet indicates that he was teaching, as she was in a posture of a rabbinical pupil. If this is the case, then Jesus defends her right to religious learning and encourages the discipleship of women, which is in line with the inclusive table fellowship and discipleship of equals characteristic of the Jesus movement. Since it's impossible to know what Martha was doing or exactly what dialogue was happening between Mary and Jesus, the emphasis on this story should be on the actions of the characters, based on what the text says. Jesus visits two women in their home with no mention of any men other than those who arrive with Jesus, something that is highly unusual in the culture. In this, Jesus recognizes and honors the full humanity of the sisters. Men didn't typically speak to women in the presence of other men, even their own women family members. Therefore, Jesus treats Martha and Mary with dignity by conversing with them. He also honors their agency by allowing each of them to make her own choice. His opinion may be that Mary makes a better choice, but he doesn't deny Martha her choice, nor does he condemn it. In addition to his direct fellowship with and ministry to women, Jesus very explicitly had women disciples and apostles, which was all but unheard of in the cultural context. The earliest mention of Jesus's women disciples is in Luke, a brief but specific account of the Galilean women who accompany Jesus as he travels and teaches. The 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom several demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chusa, and Susanna, and many others, who provided for them out of their resources. This passage explicitly states that women accompanied Jesus, being discipled by him along with the 12, as well as financially supporting Jesus' ministry. Richard Bauckham states that the relationship between these women disciples and Jesus is to be understood as continuing through the rest of Luke's narrative of Jesus' preaching ministry. That Luke doesn't mention them again until the Passion narrative doesn't suggest insignificance. Rather, their significance has already been established early in the ministry and can thereafter be taken for granted. Lucy Pepiat states unequivocally that these women were part of Jesus's inner circle, giving them a place of great standing. They were in equal discipleship with the 12 and Jesus's other male disciples. In addition to being traveling companions and disciples, several women were also patrons. Pepiat indicates the significance of this relationship, as a patron is at least one's equal, but there is also a sense of indebtedness for the beneficiary. So Jesus and his male disciples were in a position of dependence on these women. However, Bauckham emphasizes that the primary statement about the women is that, just like the 12, they accompany Jesus, and that this is what discipleship here means for both the 12 and the women. This brief account provides important context for the women's presence in the Passion narratives. Though they're not specifically mentioned again until then, it can be assumed that they accompany Jesus throughout his ministry, up until the end. Though only Luke introduces them early in the narrative of Jesus' ministry, all 4 Gospels record that Jesus' women disciples follow him to the cross and then to the tomb. The Gospel of Matthew states that many women who had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him were at the cross, including Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Mark's Gospel states that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome, who all used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, watched the crucifixion, along with many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. Luke is the only gospel that doesn't name the women at the cross, identifying them as the women who had followed him from Galilee. John records that standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. After the crucifixion, Matthew and Mark report that the 2 Marys go to the tomb and see where Jesus is buried. Again, Luke simply refers to the same group of women as those at the cross, that they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. John is the only gospel that doesn't include women in the burial of Jesus, naming only Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. The 11 are conspicuous in their absence. Matthew records that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary are the first to see the risen Jesus, and Jesus sends them to tell the disciples. Mark states that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome went to the tomb to anoint Jesus. When they arrive, a young man dressed in a white robe tells them Jesus has risen and sends them to tell the disciples. Jesus appears first to Mary Magdalene, who then goes to tell the disciples. In Luke, the same women who were at the cross and saw where Jesus was buried return to the tomb and find 2 men in dazzling clothes who tell them that Jesus is risen. Then Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them tell the disciples. John's account differs in that Mary Magdalene alone finds the empty tomb. She tells Peter and the beloved disciple, who themselves then go to the tomb, find it empty, and return home. After this, Mary Magdalene remains alone at the tomb, where the risen Jesus appears to her and sends her to tell the disciples. All four passion narratives clearly emphasize the woman's faithful discipleship. Pepiat asserts that the 11's, quote, rejection of the women's testimony and faith remains in the scriptures to their shame. The women's words and their witness are recorded for all time for all who have ears to hear. Regarding Matthew's account, Mary D'Angelo states that, quote, at the tomb, the two women prove absolutely faithful, comprehending, and obedient. The two women also become the first to see the risen Jesus and are given a message for the disciples. Swidler suggests that because the women were faithful at the cross, Jesus' burial, and returning to the tomb, they were, quote, privileged to be the first witnesses to the empty tomb and first appearances of the resurrected one. Though their testimony was then rejected by the male disciples, all four evangelists recorded the women's witness to the risen Jesus and/or the empty tomb as primary. He also unequivocally states the apostleship of the women as being sent, apostolane, by Jesus to bear witness, despite Jewish law, of the resurrection to the male disciples, thus being made apostles by Jesus. Clearly, the women in the gospel narratives are disciples and apostles of Jesus, marking their significance to Jesus himself and to the Jesus movement as a whole. In feminist terms, the passion narratives exemplify the full humanity, dignity, and agency with which Jesus has treated women throughout his life and ministry. While their presence at the crucifixion and tomb evidence their faithful devotion to Jesus, their faithfulness must be understood as a response to his treatment of them prior. In Jesus, these women saw a human worth dedicating their time, resources, and love to. Women were in the crowds who witnessed Jesus's direct encounters with women. It's possible some of those women joined his itinerant group of disciples after experiencing firsthand his humane treatment of them. At the empty tomb, Jesus honors women's full humanity, dignity, and agency when he appears to them first, and further when he commissions and entrusts them with spreading the news as evangelists to the 11. In all of these stories of Jesus and women, as well as the many not discussed, Jesus's words and deeds exemplify the feminist values of recognizing the full humanity of women as persons deserving of respect, dignity, and agency equal to men, and treating them accordingly, and of actively opposing the systemic oppression of women perpetrated by patriarchal sexism and misogyny. Additionally, in his care for the suffering of women, whether physical or otherwise, Jesus honors their embodied experiential reality. Thus, he can be imaged as an embodied feminist. These embodied elements of Jesus's life and ministry point to an ecological awareness, as his life and ministry engage the embodied experiences of himself and others in the physical realities in which they live. Christian theologians have been explicitly engaging ecology for decades, and this engagement is rooted in Christianity's foundations. However, in the rich history of Christian eco-theology, little has been said about Jesus's own embodied experiential relationship with the earth. Elizabeth A. Johnson asserts that Jesus didn't practice asceticism, that he wasn't an enemy to the pleasant things of life, and that he was far removed from philosophies that despised the body, matter, and the things of the world. Vernon Visick states that first century Palestinian Judaism had a profound ecological ethic, so Jesus was immersed in an ethos that nurtured a certain earthiness and positive enjoyment of life, including the appreciation of work, food, and sexuality. This ecological ethic includes a general awareness of human dependence upon and interdependence with nature. In addition to his embodied experiential reality, the gospel narratives include stories of Jesus's significant nature encounters, including his baptism, wilderness experience, and prayer. His nature miracles, while displaying his divine power, also exhibit an intimate knowledge of and respect for Earth's life and processes. Finally, as well as human images, Jesus uses images from the natural world in his parabolic teaching, indicating not only his own knowledge, but that he recognizes the ecological experience of his audience, who will relate to nature, agriculture, and farming metaphors. There are several episodes in Jesus' life in which the natural world plays an important role. In Jesus' adult life, the first episode is his baptism. Water baptism is still widely practiced in the contemporary Christian church, and it was also practiced in traditions that were contemporary with the early Christian church. The continuity of the ritual speaks to its rich symbolism. However, the physical experience must not be overlooked in favor of the symbolic rite. The symbolic rite retains its power through the power of the physical experience. Being immersed in water is a visceral experience. That Jesus joined his followers in participating in this experience speaks to its importance. He also instructed his disciples to continue this practice, baptizing others in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Following Jesus' baptism is his wilderness experience. The gospel accounts state that Jesus was led to the wilderness by Sophia, the Holy Spirit, was there for 40 days, and fasted for the entirety. Time spent secluded in nature, whether or not it includes fasting, is a spiritual practice common in many religious traditions, including Christianity. Following the Last Supper, Jesus takes his disciples to an outdoor space where he's then betrayed and arrested. He tells them that his soul is deeply grieved, then withdraws from them and kneels or throws himself to the ground to pray. While praying, his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. According to Luke and John, spending time in this natural space for prayer was a regular activity for Jesus. Additionally, Matthew, Mark, and John all record that between feeding the crowd and walking on water, Jesus went alone to the mountain to pray. Again, seclusion in nature is a common spiritual practice. It's attested to since the beginning of the Christian tradition in the tradition of the Desert Fathers, and continues at present-day monasteries and other retreats, in addition to individual spiritual practice. While the Gospels do not explain why Jesus engaged this practice, that he did so frequently indicates its significance. These three nature encounters, in addition to showing Jesus in relationship with the earth, all intimate a connection between ecology and spirituality. The fact that many seek eco-spiritual practice outside of traditional mainstream Christianity, despite it being rooted in Jesus's very own embodied experiential reality, speaks to the significance of re-imaging Jesus as an embodied ecofeminist. In addition to healing people, the Gospels image Jesus as a miracle worker, engaging the natural world. Early in his life and ministry, Jesus engages the Galilean fishing culture. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record Jesus calling Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John to leave their boats and nets and become fishers of people. Though it's not stated why Jesus seeks out fishers as his disciples, in Luke's account, in addition to this calling to discipleship, Jesus performs his first non-healing miracle. Luke tells that prior to the calling, Jesus gets into Peter's boat and instructs him to go out into the deep water and let down his nets. Peter replies, "Master, we have worked all night long but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." He does so, and they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to burst. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. The fishers are amazed, and after returning their boats to shore, they leave everything and follow Jesus. Luke is the only gospel to include the great catch of fish. In Matthew's and Mark's accounts, the fishers simply leave their boats and nets when Jesus calls them to follow him. Luke states that all were astounded by the great catch, and that Peter initially responds, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." It is unclear, however, whether or not Jesus performs this miracle to persuade the fishers to follow him. Considering they had been fishing all night without success, the immense catch may simply be a compassionate act of Jesus toward those who depend upon the fisher's work for their bodily well-being, especially as, unbeknownst to all present, it's their last catch. Whichever the case may be, 2 boatloads of fish is a strikingly earthy miracle with a direct impact on the physical health of those present. The image of Jesus standing on a boat during a storm, rebuking the wind and waves, is a well-known and powerful image in the Christian imagination. The message of this event in the Synoptics is often interpreted to be that his disciples' faith has room to grow. However, what seems to be glossed over is that in calming the storm and saving the disciples from the danger of drowning, Jesus' actions clearly indicate his care for their embodied human lives. And it's clearly their lives that the disciples are concerned about when they wake their sleeping teacher, shouting, "Master, Master, we are perishing!" While his words indicate that their faith is the thing at stake, by his actions, he recognizes the risk to their physical well-being and dramatically intervenes. Additionally, considering the fishing background of several of the disciples, this is a significant image of Jesus' relationship with the natural world, specifically with water. Matthew, Mark, and John all record a story of Jesus walking on water to meet the disciples. Matthew's account includes that Peter gets out of the boat, in which all of the disciples had passed a windy night, and begins walking on the water to meet Jesus. However, the wind frightens Peter, and beginning to sink, he cries out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reaches out his hand and catches him. As with calming the storm, the emphasis in this story is often placed on Jesus' rebuke of Peter's doubt, and the disciples' consequent confession that Jesus is the son of Sophia-Yahweh. However, also like calming the storm, while Jesus' words emphasize faith, his actions emphasize his care for Peter's human life. In these 3 encounters, Jesus engages the naturalness of water. While he manipulates it, he doesn't condemn it, nor does he avoid it or preach anything against it. Even in his manipulation, he respects water's earthiness, its rightful place in the world that he and his disciples inhabit. Jesus taught and preached primarily through parables, and he uses a variety of commonplace images in his teaching, drawing from the whole of life. Not only does this point to the variety of metaphors capable of relaying information about the divine, it also allows his message to be accessible to hearers of many different backgrounds, which, once again, points to his inclusive table fellowship. In addition to domestic and relational metaphors, Jesus utilizes nature metaphors in his teaching, which Edwards asserts shows him to be a person who could see the whole of life, nature, and human activities as transparent to the divine. The Synoptics all include a parable in which Jesus uses salt as a metaphor for his followers. They also all include the parable of the sower who sowed seed on 4 types of soil with 4 very different outcomes. Additionally, Jesus teaches a series of parables on the kingdom of heaven using natural metaphors for growth: a wheat field, a mustard seed, and the leavened bread. Matthew and Luke also include the parable of the 2 foundations. In addition to the parables, Jesus uses images of nature in his aphorisms. Matthew's gospel records some of the most well-known, including, "For God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. And are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father." Edwards points to these images as indicating that the God of Jesus, who could be called Abba, quote, "is the God of creation, the God of the universe, and that Jesus saw the universe as gracious. The God of creation could be trusted radically." All of Jesus's listeners encountered the natural world in some way. By using natural elements in his parables and aphorisms, Jesus not only utilizes metaphors that his listeners can relate to, he also draws their attention to the world in which they live. Rather than removing it from the visceral elements of their daily lives through abstract language, he situates his teaching in the midst of them, embodying his teaching in their lived experience. C.H. Dodd states that the realism of Jesus's parables, quote, arises from a conviction that here is no mere analogy, but an inward affinity between the natural order and the spiritual order. The sense of the divineness of the natural order is the major premise of all the parables. This is another example of Jesus's eco-spirituality in his embodied experiential reality. Edwards states that, quote, the parables reflect an observation and a love for both nature and human affairs. They reveal that Jesus saw God as the heart of nature and at the heart of human society. All of these examples clearly support imaging the gospel figure of Jesus as an embodied ecofeminist. His treatment of women evidences the feminist values of viewing women as fully human, equal in value, dignity, and agency to men, and worthy to be treated as such. Jesus also opposes patriarchal mistreatment in many forms, including oppression and violence. He clearly loves and values women as much as men and treats them equitably in his inclusive table fellowship and discipleship community. His own embodied experiential reality is evident in his human relationships, his nature experiences and miracles, and his teaching, as is his eco-spirituality. Through these and other gospel stories, Jesus lives an embodied life, demonstrates feminist values, and incorporates an ecological consciousness in his everyday interactions, teaching, and spirituality. While in Jesus's lifetime, the circumstances didn't exist to create the contemporary definition of ecofeminism, Jesus's respect for the earth and his treatment of women illustrate the attitude and actions of respect, dignity, care, and mutuality for which contemporary ecofeminists strive. Briefly, in addition to his spiritual encounters in nature, his miracles, and his nature parables, the image of Jesus as an embodied ecofeminist is apparent in other well-known passages in which he engages bodily elements, both his own and his followers. Of course, the healings directly engage the bodily well-being of humans in the world. Turning water to wine at a wedding indicates care for worldly things, such as marriage and celebration. Feeding his followers and eating with them indicate care for not only physical needs, but also physical comfort and human relationship. Drinking wine indicates appreciation for bodily pleasure and human fellowship. In addition to a lesson about servanthood and ritual purity, washing his disciples' feet shows Jesus participating in practical hygiene and cultural hospitality, which only matter if the physical body matters. He tends both the bodies and souls of his followers and does not neglect his own bodily needs. The Gospels clearly image a human Jesus who is concerned with very human things.
Yay. Thank you, Hannah. That was amazing. Here, let me get us back on gallery view here. Before we dive in, there's some people watching, and if anybody that's watching live wants to ask Hannah a question, go ahead and put it in the chat and I will pose the question to her. Okay, but first, thank you. That was so fabulous. I really enjoyed hearing you talking about it, actually. Kind of brought it more alive for me, having read the chapter first. So Cindy, I'd like to invite you to go first if you have any burning questions.
Well, I just have really enjoyed your lens. I enjoyed the chapter, and it was, as Annalisa said, it made it much more embodied as you were reading it and giving it your own inflection. Gosh, we could talk about this all night, but I guess one of my burning questions is about the Phoenician woman. And why do you interpret that as Jesus being bested by her rather than her accepting the derogatory term of being a dog? because that's sort of the common interpretation is that she's just a dog. So
Right.
how did you get that inspiration?
So, of course, I consulted many other scholars and theologians in this work. One of the most influential for this chapter as a whole was Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza. Her body of work is amazing. I read almost all of it for my dissertation. There were a couple books that weren't totally relevant, so I skipped those for now. But so she, and reading some of her essays definitely influenced me. Leonard Swidler wrote the book Jesus Was a Feminist, which was really refreshing and surprising coming from a man, I think in the 90s or early 2000s maybe. But yes, the common interpretation is that she accepts this insult of being called a dog and just kind of takes the scraps. And depending on which gospel account you focus on can color that a little bit, because I'm going to have to go back to my notes and cheat a little bit so that I say the right ones. Oh, shoot. Okay, well, that's all mixed up now. Let me see if I can find it in the slides really quickly. Okay, I could have this backwards, but I believe that it's in Matthew where Jesus responds to the woman something about, "Great is your faith, your daughter has been made well." Whereas in Mark, he responds to her, "For saying that, go in peace, your daughter has been healed." And so that suggests something beyond or different than her great faith. Great is your faith is a very, very common term that Jesus uses when he is commending people for their faith. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But every once in a while, you get a slightly different phrase from him that kind of can cause you to pause and wonder what that might mean. And so I was convinced by my different sources' arguments that Jesus, in that moment, was schooled a little bit. That she presented the opportunity to him to expand his ministry beyond Israel, beyond the Jewish community, and that he does so in that moment. I am convinced that it was more than her supposedly humbly receiving the insult of being a dog. I think that as a Jewish scholar and as a rabbi, he would have thought really critically about her response and what that was going to mean for him moving forward. It wasn't going to ever be just in that moment. He wasn't just making a one-time exception. In that moment, he takes to heart what she says and makes a decision to expand his ministry.
Well, I really appreciate your scholarship because I think it's so important that we reimagine these common interpretations of Bible stories. That's what my class is all about. Your chapter is giving me great fodder for my class. But just that idea that we have to reinterpret, and that our interpretation and inspiration of these stories is just as important as anybody else's and just as legitimate. And you have done the study and the support for it. So I just love the interpretation that you've brought to it and love the process. So
thank you.
I'll give you a turn, Annalisa.
Okay. Yeah, we can go in any order that feels right. By the way, Hawk Kathy said, "Thank you, Hannah."
Hi, Kathy.
Dramatic Disaster has also been typing some messages in here.
Oh, that's my fiance.
Anyway, so I have an interpretation that I want to talk to you about too, and it actually changed my view because I wrote about the bleeding woman in my dissertation as well, when I was trying to look at like ancient Christian attitudes towards menstruation. And so the point that I had gotten into in my dissection of it was, well, I think that this, this section is really about, trying to show off Jesus's power, and it's not so much about the woman per se. And that he doesn't explicitly overturn, like explicitly as in verbally, overturn the Levitican purity laws around menstruation. And so that's kind of where I gotten with it. So I was like, it's hard to know what his actual viewpoints on it were, even though he would have known, like you brought up in the chapter, that by her touching him, they both would have known this, that she was polluting him, basically, in that worldview. But the way that you put it, it was like he didn't have to say it, just his actions replaced the words, his actions of accepting her and having a conversation with her. And I think, as you say in the text, like calling her out, making her more known to the crowd, that action in and of itself was like him saying, like disagreeing with the purity and impurity. So that was really illuminating for me.
He also called her daughter and made her family. So that was huge for me within that story, is that he brings her into family and calling her daughter. So yeah, she was important.
Yeah. I think sometimes in that respect, it's like, that's when I'm like, and I think I wrote this too, I was like, I think it says a lot more about like the writers of the text more than Jesus himself. And I think that happens a lot with like, the interpretation, who's writing it and then who's rewriting it and writing it. Like, that can also, because oftentimes women aren't given names in the Bible, like she's just like the woman, right? So,
yeah.
Anyway.
However, for as often as men are called sons in the Gospels, there are not nearly as many uses of the term daughter, even in some of the really well-known interactions between Jesus and women. So I think that it is worthwhile to take note of the significance of when Jesus does call a woman daughter, just because it is very rare.
Well, I have another question, but Cindy, do you want to go? You want to go back and forth?
Sure, that's fine. Because I think they're gonna completely overlap each other, I'm sure. So in my dissertation about Mary Magdalene, I talked about how many times, or the anointing woman, the naming of him as Messiah, and I was just startled by your chapter and how many other places I hadn't recognized that he is called Messiah by a woman. So that was really interesting to me. I also, like your point, Annalisa, about the interpretation of the writer, the author, and how many times it's been changed and names that were changed and all the different things. So there's some new research about the story of Mary and Martha in John, that the name Martha was changed, that it was actually Mary. So it's Mary and Mary. So Mary of Bethany, they're now thinking is Mary Magdalene, and they're taking the idea of Magdala as tower, and being like Peter was the rock, Magdala is the tower. So, but this new research about the Martha story, so Luke is not, so they're saying that this new research is showing that there are two separate groups of women, which I found to be fascinating. And my thought around so many, especially with all the places that you brought up about in my terms, the divine feminine naming the divine masculine, the Messiah, the Savior, is that it was necessary, that we had to have that divine feminine come in order for the divine masculine to be reincarnated, right? And so I was just really fascinated with the number of places that you pointed that out, because I just didn't I hadn't seen all of those, so that was fun. Yeah. So I don't know that there's a question in there. I was just acknowledging all those spots that and that sinner has become that common interpretation again, that sinner has become the equivalent of prostitute, when sinner could have just having your hair down. You're a sinner, right? I mean,
Could have spoken to a man out of place.
Right.
all of that. Well, and yeah. So exactly. Anyway, so that I just love that. So that's just my comments, I guess. Annalisa, go ahead.
Well, I'd love for you to share that research too at some point. I want to read whatever you found in the matter. Something that struck me, and I apologize if you did touch on this and I didn't hear it. But I'm wondering, in your opinion, if because you spoke to the fact that Jesus, toward the end when we were talking about eco-spirituality, Jesus recognizing that Yahweh as the great creator of the universe, and because everything is created by him, it is divine. This is how I'm interpreting what you would, right? But I'm wondering if you believe, because that's a little bit different, or can be different than thinking about divinity in terms of immanence. Like, do you think that Jesus saw the divine as immanent in nature, or as something that's kind of molded? The divine molds nature, and so it's divine by virtue of having been crafted in that way.
Yeah. I don't go into that so much in this chapter specifically, but I will talk about it because it is part of my dissertation as a whole. So I would say that the divine is revealed in nature. And to me, and this is kind of part of my spiritual perspective in general, if it resonates with someone for that to mean there is a bit of the divine itself in nature, if that's what speaks to them, if that's what provides them spiritual nourishment, I see nothing wrong with that interpretation. If someone else receives spiritual nourishment by understanding that the divine is revealed in nature because it is created by the divine, then I see no problem with that understanding of it. The one distinction I will make for myself is the difference between pantheism and panentheism. So pantheism being the belief that all is God, pan being all, theism, God, all is God. Panentheism is so pan, all, en, in, the, God. All is in God and God is in all. And so that is my personal interpretation. And I understand that not so much in thinking that a tree or a rock or a flower or a stream or a mountain has whatever qualities I attribute to the divine, rather that all of creation, all of the cosmos, all of created being somehow exists within the divine and therefore cannot help but have some element of the divine also existing in and through it. So that would be my personal understanding.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Cindy?
I have not heard that definition of panentheism, and that's beautiful. Oh, I really love that. Yeah, identifying as a lesbian, just put that out there. It's like that's really empowering and lovely. So I'm interested in Jesus as the ecological part and the supporter of the earth, and just physics is the wrong word to bring into this, but just his multiplying of the fish in so many different stories. And it makes me wonder, I mean, fish is certainly in the Mediterranean and in that time was such a staple, right? If you live near the water, it was life. I mean, fish and water are our life, right? And I'm interested in your thoughts about if there's some other words that I'm unaware of that you've come across, this idea of the multiplying and his knowledge of the elements and an expansive view of life, how you see that. I mean, just whatever comes to you, because it's not a very clear, pointed question, but just what you see with his abilities with that. Because he did the same thing with wine, which I truly love. So
yeah. So I would say that the transmutation of the water to wine, the multiplying of the bread and fish, I think that, to me, honestly, those are some of the stories, some of the miracles that speak the most directly to the idea of embodied ecofeminism, because he is taking these natural elements, food and drink, and so with the wine's not technically necessary. We might like to think that it is, but technically it's not. We could all survive without it. But food, we all need that to live. And on top of that, we all need it to be comfortable. And so when he turns water to wine at the wedding, I think really speaks to his embracing and enjoying of his embodied human life. He's there fellowshipping with other people. He's there celebrating with other people. And he takes it upon himself, granted at his mother's request, to essentially allow the party to keep going. He could have just been like, wine's out, party's over. But for some reason, he's like, nah, let's keep partying for a little while longer. And so much of that to me speaks to the relational human parts of him. With the bread and the fish, he recognizes he's got these crowds of people who are listening to him teach. And the disciples bring it to his attention that it's getting kind of late and nobody has anything for dinner. So I kind of imagine they're kind of hinting at, don't you think it's time to call tonight, Jesus? Let's go home. Let's go find some food. And Jesus, knowing probably that they're like, let's go home. Let's call it a night. He's like, no, we're just going to feed everybody. We're just going to make this a huge feast. And it's a little prequel to, the feast in the kingdom of heaven. And I'm going to feed people because they need to eat. Their bodies need nourishment. And also that means, again, we get to hang out longer. They're not going to be distracted by their stomach grumbling. They're going to be totally content to just continue having this fellowship. And I get to keep teaching, and we just get to keep doing what we're doing. The fact that it's fish specifically, again, culturally makes a lot of sense because of where they were. It does, however, hint at a tie to the fact that so many of his disciples were fishers, and he called them away specifically from that occupation in order to follow him and be fishers of people. Also, the water thing, and I didn't mention this in my presentation, although I do mention it in my dissertation, a lot of Jesus's non-healing miracles have to do with water, which I think is really interesting. from both a feminist and a depth psychological lens, because in depth psychology, water is often a symbol of chaos, transformation, renewal. Sometimes it can be very dangerous if you're talking about a night sea journey. And then in feminism, of course, as a feminist symbol, water is completely connected to life and birth because of the waters of the womb. And so the fact that Jesus interacts with water in so many direct and indirect ways throughout his life and ministry is not something I've been able to dive into specifically, but as I was doing my research for my dissertation, it kept popping up and I was like, I think there's something here. I think there's something here.
I look forward to you continuing that journey and sharing it. But I'm with you on that. I agree.
I'd like to add something here. Based on some research I'm doing right now into ancient Mesopotamia and some of their funerary rituals, they would do libations with barley wine or with barley beer and also wine. And so I was reading into why, how and the why. And so one of the researchers was describing wine in a way where, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, wine is talked about as the elixir of life. And that maybe it was used in these funerary rituals to provide abundance and, fecundity. And this researcher was saying, also red, like the red wine has the associations with blood and the blood of life and the life force power. And also that the life process that a grape goes to become wine is like a death rebirth process. So that was the symbolism that they were seeing in Mesopotamia and Anatolian funerary rituals. So obviously this is earlier than Jesus' time period, but because I think a lot of those customs were so influential on, ancient Israel, that there might be somewhere a relationship or, a lineage of kind of symbology, something to look into maybe.
Yeah, well, and turning water into wine at the wedding isn't the only time Jesus encounters wine either. There's, of course, communion, the Eucharist, but there's also a couple of passages sprinkled throughout the Gospels where he's called a drunkard because he just likes to sit and have a glass of wine with his friends while he's hanging out. And so there's, and of course, wine had a cultural place at the time, but Jesus embraces that in however many meanings and symbols wine might contain. Obviously, I focused on the fact that it is a bodily pleasure and typically a relational beverage. And so really focusing on the embodied humanness that really exemplifies in Jesus. But yeah, wine definitely comes around a few times throughout the Gospels.
Totally. I want to read another comment by Kathy. I hope that's okay, Kathy. She said, oh, interesting. I hadn't heard of water being associated with chaos. Food for thought. I have always associated it with healing and cleansing. I don't know if you want to respond to that or.
Yeah. So healing and cleansing would, if I'm looking at the two different lenses between feminism and depth psychology, healing and cleansing would fall a little bit more probably under the feminism lens of looking at water because it is associated with birth and rebirth, which often has the healing and cleansing connotations with it as well. From a depth psychological perspective, especially looking at mythology, water often comes up as a danger, as an obstacle, as something that the hero or the heroine or the protagonist has to somehow overcome. The first that comes to mind for me is in the Odyssey, when Odysseus and his men are on the ship and they're having to sail between Scylla and Charybdis, these two water monsters essentially, and they got to get out. They have to move. There's a storm. The water is dangerous, and then there are these two water entities that each pose their own significant danger as well. And so, that's an example from mythology. Of course, we know that water can be dangerous with hurricanes or tsunamis or flooding. And so looking even just at the really natural, like real life examples of the danger of water can cause a lot of chaos. However, if you're going to look at kind of trying to reconcile, I guess, the two ideas with, birth and rebirth, death is in there somewhere. That's part of the cycle of life. And so you have water associated with birth through the womb. You can have water associated with death because it is dangerous. It is chaotic. It can pose a challenge. And then as you go through death, whether it is death of a season in life, or death of a relationship somehow, or death of expectations, whatever you're facing at the time, as you then come out through the cycle of rebirth and you come into whatever is new, whatever is next, you are essentially re-entering the water to be born again. And so you have that cleansing and that rejuvenating and that healing element of water, which is, of course, what the waters of baptism kind of encompasses, all of those things. You're immersed in the water and you come out cleansed or purified or born again or renewed, whatever language you want to use.
I love that. I always say I take the path of the middle way, the Buddhist middle way. Anything in excess can be dangerous. Anything that's healthy for you, as a glass of water, good. But if you chug a whole, 5 gallons of water, that's also dangerous. You're gonna die.
Yep.
Well, and I was thinking of the Jungian thing of water being consciousness, right? And the subconscious, right? And the idea of Jesus calming the storm, right? So it's that, again, that his awareness, I guess, of the turmoil within the disciples, especially Peter, typical Peter, but that idea of consciousness and how aware Jesus was of that in all of his healings. I mean, all of his work.
Yeah.
I think I interrupted you, Annalisa. I'm sorry.
No. It's perfect. I wanted to also kind of reiterate, I think, how important it is that you're using the term embodied, because I really kept coming back to it while I was reading the chapter. And I was like, I wonder why it's important for her to keep using it over and over again. But it's starting to sink in that it's really about the marrying the spirit with the physical, the matter, and how affirming Jesus' actions are to the material embodied experience of life itself. And so I can see why that would be important to reiterate over and over and over again in a tradition that has constantly asked us for a long time to, deny our bodies, or think sex is bad, or menstruation is a curse.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to acknowledge that, because I think it just took me a little while to understand how important that piece is to actually say out loud.
Yeah. I also think the idea of the body being bad and menstruation and all those are so anti-goddess. They're so anti-earth. They're so anti-feminine. That I think this is another point that you've made, Hannah, because Jesus very pointedly in all the places that you have written about, embodying all these things, plus this deliberate engagement with women and lifting them up. I mean, boy, when you think about it in that way, it really does kind of blow your mind about your whole basis for all of this, right? Is that he was absolutely a supporter of women, and how countercultural that was. Yeah.
Totally. I would love for us to talk about Mary Magdalene a little bit.
Oh darn.
Her feast day. And I'm not sure what the starting point is, even though it seems like it should be obvious, but I don't know. Do either of you have anything in particular you'd like to say about Mary? Or should I start the thread?
Well, as both of you know, when you are figuring out what to include in your dissertation, you have to make really deep cuts. There are so many things that you come across in your research that you're like, oh, this is amazing. I've got to talk about this. And then you get an outline or something going and you're like, oh no, this chapter is going to be like as long as the whole dissertation is supposed to be if I keep everything in here. And so Mary Magdalene ended up being kind of one of those deep cuts, primarily because I wrote my dissertation as though I was speaking to other, what I call recovering evangelicals. So those who were disillusioned with evangelical Christianity, but weren't ready to just shut the door on it completely. Mary Magdalene is chock full of so much going on, so many perspectives, so many traditions, so much devotion. And so I touch on her briefly in the chapter, mostly to really highlight the fact that she was a devoted and faithful disciple of Jesus. She was there at the beginning of his ministry in Galilee, and she was there till the bitter end at the cross. And then she was there at the tomb, and then she was there to see him risen. And that was mostly to try to counteract the unfortunate traditional idea of her as a sinner or a prostitute taking center stage. The idea that, she only matters because she was a terrible sinner and Jesus forgave her, that's all she has to offer to Christianity. I really wanted to try to push back against that image by highlighting specifically what's said about her in the Gospels. I had to not go into the so-called Gnostic Gospels for the sake of time, as well as, again, thinking about a recovering evangelical audience that wouldn't necessarily be ready to engage the Gnostic Gospels. So it was hard. It was hard I had a whole section outlined. I had paragraphs written, and I was looking at everything and I was like, I can't, it's just not going to fit this time.
Can you share at all what you had thought about discussing, any of the themes?
So before I decided I wasn't going to include the Gnostic Gospels, I had looked at those, and what really stuck out to me with that is that you have, I want to say it's the Gospel of Mary, is the one where she and Jesus and a handful of the 11 disciples are all together having a conversation. And the fact that she is there by herself, as far as a woman, the only woman in the room, having this conversation, and is engaging in theological conversation with Jesus and the disciples, like some of the women, some of the other women in the Gospels have theological conversation with Jesus, really stood out to me, especially the fact that Jesus defends her when whichever disciple gets a little antsy about her being there. Peter? Yeah.
Always Peter.
Always Peter.
I mean, it's a pattern, right? It's a pattern to me.
Yeah.
Throughout the Gospels, through the Gnostic, all of that, it's a pattern of Peter versus Mary. And to me, it's showing the typical, the common interpretation. Peter is conservatism and Mary Magdalene is liberalism, right? I mean, it's those two things, and you see it throughout. And that grouping of her preaching what Jesus has told her in this vision in the Gospel of Mary, I think there are other women there, but they're not named, right?
Okay.
So that's my interpretation. And I get irritated sometimes with some of the fandom around Magdalene because I think it lessens her power. And I see her as a necessary component of Jesus' resurrection. So I see her as very integral to the whole Christian story. Yeah.
Yeah.
Annalisa,
Well,
go ahead.
No, keep going. I want to hear that thought continue. Unless Hannah wants to go.
Well, I completed that thought. Go ahead, Hannah.
Okay. Certainly from a mythological perspective, Mary Magdalene can be understood as a consort figure. And whether that means legal wife, whether that means sexual lover, or whether that means dear female friend and confidant, will probably be debated until the end of time. But mythologically, she certainly can be viewed in that way. Jumping back, I'm pretty sure it was Leonard Sweidler in Jesus Was a Feminist, although I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that. But in one of my sources, which was really fascinating, and I really wanted to talk about it, but I didn't because I felt like I was would have been opening a can of worms. Male scholar, author, makes a case for Mary Magdalene actually being the author of the Gospel of John and the beloved disciple.
I've read that too.
Yeah. So, you know, and not to invalidate devotional tradition or practice or interpretation, but there is, you know, serious biblical scholarship looking into the potential of Mary Magdalene as the author of one of the Gospels. So I think that is really interesting, and I really hope that more comes of that inquiry. It made a lot of sense to me as I was reading his kind of argument for that interpretation. But I wouldn't have been able to include that in my dissertation, so I'm just including it here real quick.
That's cool. Well, I just was more curious to hear what you two had to say about her. You know, I myself have been working with her purely on a mythological archetypal basis, because once I decided to give up trying to figure out who the real Mary Magdalene was, I was like, I just got to work with the archetypal, because my belief is that she, for those of us who she calls, that you want to say into her ministry or into her, you know, into her service in some way, like she comes to us in the image or in the scenario in which we most need healing or are lacking wholeness. So I'm always curious to find out from other women, especially like what Mary Magdalene means to them.
I think we can really go down a rabbit hole if we try to pinpoint who she is exactly, because I mean, if we really come down to it, this is going to blow your evangelical friends' minds, but we can't even prove Jesus existed. right?
Right.
I mean, if we're going to go scientifically, we have one line that says Jesus was crucified. Well, he wasn't the only Jesus. I read somewhere too that 50% of women in that time were named Mary. So no wonder we're like, who the hell? Sorry. But I think we can get really caught up in trying to put a definition. And, if Mary Magdalene wrote the Gospel of John, then that was before Paul wrote his letters, right? Because his was like 62, 65, some 70, somewhere in there. And who was the next one? I don't even remember. Mark, I think, was next in the 80s. So that would put John at a very different time than what they think he was written. And so it just becomes very complicated. And I agree, Annalisa, that it's Mary Magdalene becomes who you need her to be. And I see her in all of this feminism that is coming out today, and the power that women are, and we see her being called a prostitute once again when they take away our rights for healthcare, as women, as transgender people, all these things. I mean, that's where I see a lot of Magdalene, is in staying strong and pushing with that. But yeah, I can't get too caught up in the weeds, because there's just no way to really put a definition on her about when and where. Yeah.
So if she had written the Gospel of John, would she also theoretically be the author of the Gospel of Mary? Or we don't even know.
No, the Gnostics are like 200, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. The Gnostic Gospels were written more than a century after the supposed crucifixion date.
It would have been at best an oral tradition.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
all of them,
so
yeah.
long.
All of the Gospels began as oral traditions, and that's the theory that she may have written the Gospel of John isn't necessarily that she physically wrote down what we have today and call the Gospel of John, but rather that what we have today that we call the Gospel of John was the tradition around her own house church. So the idea that she actually opened her home to followers of Jesus and then led them as the teacher. And so the Gospel of John then became the oral tradition around her retelling of her experiences with Jesus on the road throughout his ministry. And so then somewhere along the lines, a few decades later, somebody wrote it down.
Fascinating.
Yeah, that I'd heard that about the Gospel of Mary, but I hadn't heard that about John. So that's really interesting. Really, and I think too, both of you have talked about how the Bible, first it was oral, and then it's written down, and then it's changed according to whoever comes through. Like if this new research that says that Mary's name was changed to Martha, right? And or Junia was changed, all those different names that were just changed because of somebody's either their own opinion or we can't give. And I really think that there was a concerted effort to take away Magdalene's power. I mean, very deliberate. So we don't know, right, with all that stuff. So that's why I love your reinterpretation of this reimaging of both Jesus and all that comes up. I mean, it just gives a whole new. Now I'm going to be jumping into research myself. You've just totally inspired me again. So thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Checking out the time here. I think we can start to wrap up, but I'd love for you, before we do that, I'd love for you maybe to share with us what you'd like other women, evangelicals or former evangelicals like yourself, what message you'd like to share with them now that you're on the other side of this journey.
Yeah. So it's actually similar to what the two of you were kind of saying about Mary Magdalene and how she comes to women individually in the way that they need her. when they need her, how they need her. I believe the same can be said of Jesus. I believe very strongly of that because my parents were Christians when I was born. I have been steeped in this since I was in the womb. But my relationship with Jesus, my understanding of him, the primary image I have of him in my soul has changed over the years, depending on what I was going through in my life, what I needed from my spirituality and my birth tradition, or what I needed pushing against my birth tradition. And it's the whole thing is really like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I am so intimately and painfully aware of the oppression and the abuse and the violence that women and people of every other marginalized group have experienced at the hands of Christianity, supposedly justified by Jesus himself. When really, if you can let go of all of the doctrine and theology that has been written primarily by men over the last 2,000 years, none of whom walked with Jesus, none of whom even knew somebody who knew Jesus, and has all been interpreted politically and culturally and militaristically and all of that, right? If you can go back, and of course you can't go completely back unless you can read Greek or Hebrew, but as close as you can, you go back to the Gospels and rediscover the Jesus who is depicted in them. Because yes, I found a lot of really wonderful scholars and theologians who aided my research, but it was going back to the Gospels and reading those stories of Jesus with women, Jesus with other marginalized people, which I talk about a lot in a different chapter when I talk about him as a manifestation of the archetypal Christ. That's where I could finally reconcile the fact that I could no longer identify with Christianity as I had been raised in it. But I also I didn't even want to let go of Jesus. It wasn't just that I couldn't. It wasn't that I just kept finding myself coming back to him like outside of my power. I wanted to. There was something there. And so when I went back to the Gospels and I read these stories and I tried my best to forget the doctrine and the theology and the commentary that has, I've been exposed to over my life and just sit with the stories as stories and let them work on my soul, work on my psyche, work on my imagination. That's where it really just this re-imaging of Jesus as an embodied ecofeminist and as a manifestation of the archetypal Christ really came out and just got me so excited. And I wrote my dissertation as a third way, as the middle way, Anna, for recovering evangelical women especially, but really anyone who has been hurt by Christianity but still feels that tug that they can step away from institutional Christianity. They can step away from mainstream. They can step away from orthodoxy and established tradition and denominations, and they can still follow Jesus. They can do that in their own way, outside of the church proper. And if that resonates with them, if that brings them life and nourishment and joy, then I hope they can find that, because that's what I was looking for. And I feel like I found it for myself. And I really, really hope that that can be a step for others to find that if that's what they're looking for.
I love that. That's cool. Thank you so much. And I hope that you continue this work and, other presentations and maybe a book or articles or all of it. So thank you for being here and sharing some of your doctoral work with us so fresh after receiving your doctorate. I snagged you right away. I was like, one of the first, I guess. Gets her to speak about her work. Dr. Cindy, thank you also for being here. You made the conversation that much more rich and nuanced. So, and to everybody watching, thank you so much for being here. And I think a lot of you are Hannah's supporters, Dr. Hannah's supporters, so thank you for being here. And if you like this, please hit like, please subscribe to the channel, please leave more comments and share it with like-minded souls. And until next time, we'll see you all soon, but I'm going to keep you two on the call. Okay, bye everybody.